All right, so we're diving into Beowulf today, and I bet some of you are thinking, what's a poem about monsters and mead halls got to do with my Catholic faith?
Right.
Yeah, well, that's kind of what we're going to be looking at. Like, how can we look at Beowulf through a Catholic lens?
Yeah, it might seem kind of strange at first, like, what do these two things have to do with each other? But it actually gets really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, this is a work from pre-Christian Germany and Scandinavia,
Right, right.
and we don't even know who wrote it, but
Yeah.
it was a time when Christianity was really spreading.
Mm.
So it's very likely that the author was influenced by, those new Christian ideas.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's one of the things that makes it so fascinating is how these kind of like pagan ideas are being mixed with, these new Christian ideas that are coming in.
Yeah, so even though it's rooted in this pagan world,
Yeah.
there's a chance it was influenced by early Christianity.
Absolutely, yeah, for
Mm.
sure.
Wow.
And one of the most clear examples of this is this passage called the Creation Hymn.
The creation hymn, what's that?
Yeah. Yeah, so it's a passage in Beowulf where the scop, that's kind of like their word for like a bard or a poet, he recounts the creation of the world. And what's really fascinating is how much it mirrors the Genesis narrative from the Bible.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it describes God creating the earth surrounded by water and then setting the sun and the moon in the heavens. It's very, very similar.
Oh, wow. So you're saying there's this pagan poem that sounds like it came straight from the Bible.
It's really striking.
I mean, I knew that, there were some parallels between mythology and the Bible, but this seems like it's something else.
Yeah, it really suggests that the author, was at least familiar with or influenced by some early Christian ideas about creation. But here's where it gets even more interesting. The hymn, even though it aligns with Genesis, it also starts to introduce elements of pagan belief.
Oh, okay. So it's not just a straight copy-paste from the Bible. There's
Yeah.
like a blending of ideas happening here.
Right. It's like the author is trying to kind of like weave together these two different belief systems. And it creates this really interesting tension between, Christianity and paganism that actually runs throughout the whole poem.
So, as a Catholic, how should I look at that? Should I be trying to like force a Christian interpretation onto it?
Yeah.
Or what?
I don't think that's really the right approach. It's more about recognizing both the echoes of our faith and the values of this pre-Christian worldview that are kind of distinct. It's about understanding the context and appreciating, like, where it connects and where it diverges.
Okay, so we're not trying to force anything, but just sort of having this dialogue between what we see in the text and our own faith.
Exactly.
See how they kind of play off of each other.
Yeah, and that's what makes exploring literature through this Catholic lens so enriching. It helps
Yeah.
us engage on this like deeper level and uncover these unexpected connections and just gain a whole new perspective on our faith and the power of storytelling.
So we've got this creation hymn that's hinting at a Christian influence, but there's also this tension with the pagan beliefs.
Right.
Where do we go from there?
Well, let's move on to another kind of compelling figure, Grendel,
Oh, yeah?
the big monstrous antagonist of Beowulf.
Everyone's favorite swamp monster.
Right.
Yeah, it's easy to see him as just this, embodiment of evil. But I'm guessing there's more to it.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. From a Catholic perspective, Grendel kind of becomes more than just like a mindless beast. He starts to represent temptation, the allure of sin,
I'll look.
and the destructive power of these, demonic forces that we know exist.
And it's interesting, too, because even his lair, like this dark, swampy
Right.
cave, that's not just some random setting, is it?
Right. No, not at all. I mean, think about it. It really evokes this like imagery of evil that we see a lot in the Bible. Think about the wilderness where Christ was tempted by Satan.
Mm-hmm.
These environments, a lot of times in literature, they reflect kind of a spiritual state.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, so Grendel's lair, it's almost like this visual representation of that darkness that can just totally consume us when we, stray from the path of righteousness.
So we can actually look at Grendel, not just as a monster, but as like representing this struggle we face,
Exactly.
this temptation, this evil.
Absolutely.
And so Beowulf's fight against Grendel, that takes on a whole new meaning now. It's not just some physical battle, it's a spiritual battle.
Exactly. Yeah, for sure.
It's like, are we looking at Beowulf himself as some kind of like Christ-like hero?
Oh, that's a great question.
I mean, he is brave, he's strong, he's selfless. He even sacrifices himself in the end. It's easy to see those like Christ-like qualities in him.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from. There definitely are parallels between like his heroic traits and, the virtues that we kind of admire in Christ. But I think we have to be a little bit careful about making that direct comparison.
Right, because Beowulf is driven by earthly glory and loyalty to the king,
Exactly, yeah.
not by divine love like Christ.
Right. His heroism is very much rooted in those like warrior culture values, whereas Christ's sacrifice, completely transcends those earthly concerns. But even with those differences, I think there are these moments in Beowulf that really resonate with, what we believe as Catholics.
Like when he battles Grendel's mother underwater.
Oh, yeah, that's a great one.
It's hard not to see that as some sort of parallel to Christ's descent into hell,
Right.
that journey into the depths to conquer evil.
Yeah, that's a really great connection. It shows how, like, even stories from totally different cultures and, totally different eras
Hmm.
can still touch on these, like, universal themes that kind of speak to our beliefs. So while, Beowulf might not be a Christ figure, I think his journey can still kind of inspire us to reflect on, like, courage and sacrifice and, that battle between good and evil that we all face.
So we've seen that this pre-Christian poem has these surprising connections to our faith,
Right.
but also these key differences in, like, the worldview. And I'm starting to see how looking at it through a Catholic lens can deepen our understanding of both the text and our own beliefs.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's what's so rewarding about this kind of deep dive. We're uncovering these like hidden gems of connection, and we can use those as like this springboard for a deeper reflection on our faith and like just the human experience.
Awesome. So what else can we unpack here?
Well, let's talk about fate and providence.
Okay.
This has always been something that I've kind of struggled with because Beowulf seems very focused on this idea of fate. It governs, what happens.
Okay.
But as Catholics, we believe in God's providence. So how do those two ideas fit together? It seems like they're coming from completely opposite places.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like, are these two totally separate forces at work here or what?
That's the question, right? Like, are they completely separate or is there some way to see them as connected? It's a tough one. I mean, this idea of fate, it feels very deterministic, right? Like everything is predetermined.
Yeah, like there's no free will. Like whatever's going to happen is just going to happen. You can't do anything about it. Reminds me of those Greek tragedies, like everyone's doomed from the start.
Exactly, yeah. But maybe when we look closer, Weird isn't so different from God's providence. Maybe it's not really about these two, like, opposing forces, but rather, two different ways of understanding the same reality.
So are you saying that weird could be like how God's will plays out in the world of Beowulf?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
So it's not like God is forcing things to happen,
Yeah.
but he's working within that, that framework of fate to accomplish his purposes.
Right.
That's cool. So even in this pre-Christian world, God's presence is still like being felt, even if they don't quite understand it the way we do now.
Exactly, yeah. And that leads us to another really fascinating aspect of Beowulf,
Okay.
how the poem explores kind of good and evil.
Okay. Yeah. We talked about Grendel as like a symbol of temptation, but I
Yeah.
feel like it goes, beyond that.
Absolutely, yeah. It presents this really complex interplay between light and darkness, both within like the characters themselves and in the world around them.
Yeah, it's definitely not black and white. Like even Beowulf, he's the hero,
Right.
but he's not perfect.
Right.
Like he has flaws. He struggles with pride, a thirst for glory.
Exactly. He's not this like perfect saint. He's a flawed human being who is kind of striving for greatness. And I
Yeah.
think that's what makes him such a compelling character. We see ourselves in him, like in those struggles between, virtue and vice. It's that classic battle between, wanting to do good, but also being tempted to kind of stray from that path, which is something that, I think we can all relate to as Catholics.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So it's like the poem is saying, like, hey, look, we all have this capacity for good and evil within us,
Right.
And the choices that we make, the paths that we choose, those are what ultimately determine who we become.
And that connects really well with the Catholic understanding of like free will and making choices and following God's law.
Exactly. Yeah. Like our choices have real consequences,
Hmm.
not just, in this life, but for eternity.
Yeah.
So we've got this like, really complex view of good and evil. We've got this idea that fate and providence maybe are working together.
Right.
So what else can we kind of, glean from Beowulf through this like, Catholic lens that we're looking at it through?
Well, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about community.
Mm-hmm.
Because, Beowulf is full of heroism,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not just about, individual glory, right?
Mm.
There's this really strong sense of community,
Yeah.
of loyalty, of responsibility, like to one's king,
Yeah.
to one's fellow warriors.
You see that throughout the whole poem, like Beowulf risking his life for Hrothgar and the Banes. And even Wiglaf, like standing by Beowulf, even when everyone else runs away, it's all about those like bonds of loyalty. It is. And you know that bond that's between the Lord and the warriors? It actually has a name. It's called comitatus.
Okay.
And it's this ancient Germanic like code of conduct. It's built on this like, deep trust, loyalty, this willingness to fight for each other and even to die for each other.
Viltatus. Got it.
Yeah, so how does this warrior code connect with our Catholic faith?
Yeah, it seems like a pretty different world, than what we live in today.
Yeah, on the surface, absolutely. But, take a look at the underlying principles. Comitatus, it emphasizes, self-sacrifice, loyalty, putting the needs of others, before your own. And those are values that I think resonate really deeply with our Catholic beliefs.
You're right. It's kind of like their version of like, charity and solidarity.
Exactly.
Like we're called to love our neighbors, support each other, work together for the common good.
Exactly. So even though the context is different, right?
Mm.
You've got like this warrior culture versus, a Christian community, the core values, they're surprisingly similar.
Wow. It's amazing to think that we can find these echoes of our faith, in a poem that on the surface seems so different from us.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's the beauty of exploring literature through this Catholic lens.
Mm.
We can discover these unexpected connections, these like universal truths that transcend, time and culture. And it makes you realize that maybe we're not so different from these, ancient people.
Uh-huh.
We may have different beliefs and practices, but we still share these fundamental values.
Right.
This yearning for something, greater than ourselves.
That's a good point. So we talked about fate, good and evil, community.
Yeah.
What other aspects of Beowulf can we look at through this Catholic lens?
Well, there's one more kind of, fascinating layer that I'd like to explore.
Okay.
It's something that I think often gets overlooked, but, it's deeply relevant to our understanding as Catholics, and that is the roles of women.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, yeah, Beowulf's definitely a very, like, masculine story.
Yeah.
It's all about these warriors and these battles. But you're right. There are some important women in there.
Exactly. And they play really important roles, even if they're not, out there swinging swords.
Right.
Like, take Wealhtheow, for example. She's Hrothgar's queen, and she's this figure of peace and wisdom. She's always trying to maintain, harmony in the mead hall, prevent bloodshed.
Right. It's like she's the voice of reason in this, world of violence and revenge.
Exactly. And then you have, Grendel's mother.
Oh, yeah.
Right, who's this, like, fierce, vengeful figure. She's not your typical damsel in distress.
No, definitely not. She's a force to be reckoned with.
Right.
Yeah, it's like she's driven by this love for her son, this, like, need to protect him.
Yes, absolutely. And I think both Wealhtheow and Grendel's mother, despite their differences, they highlight the complexities of womanhood.
Mm.
They kind of defy this simplistic idea that women in these, like, warrior cultures, we're just these passive figures.
So even though it seems like it's this very male-dominated world, women still, had an influence,
Absolutely.
played important roles. It's kind of like they were holding things together while all the men were off fighting.
Right. And I think it's really important for us as Catholics to kind of recognize and appreciate, those diverse roles that women have played, throughout history and across different cultures.
For sure. It reminds us that, women have always been there, contributing their gifts and perspectives.
Exactly. So we can learn a lot from these, female characters in Beowulf, even though their stories might be brief compared to, the epic battles of the male heroes. They still challenge us to kind of think critically about the roles that women have played and how those contributions have often been, overlooked or minimized.
Yeah, it's like they're these hidden figures,
Right.
But they're these powerful forces that are shaping events, behind the scenes.
Absolutely.
And maybe that's something we need to think about today, too. Looking beyond the surface
Yeah.
and appreciating the contributions of everyone.
Yeah, well said. And I think that's a perfect kind of segue into, this final part of our kind of deep dive. We've explored a lot of different things here, found these like, really unexpected connections between Beowulf and our Catholic faith.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen how this, pre-Christian poem can offer us insights into, good and evil and community and fate and, even the roles of women.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey.
It has. And in this final part, we're going to kind of, delve into some even kind of, deeper themes like the tension between, the material and the spiritual, the poem's kind of portrayal of death, and even like the idea of grace, in this pre-Christian context.
That sounds fascinating.
Yeah.
I can't wait. Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Beowulf,
Yeah.
looking at it through this Catholic lens.
Yeah.
And I'm ready to unpack some of those deeper themes that you mentioned before.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where should we start? Well, let's talk about something that I think is pretty central to both Beowulf and our faith.
Okay.
And that's the kind of tension between the material world and the spiritual,
Okay.
because Beowulf is a poem that's full of like treasure and feasting and, epic battles. It's very much grounded in this physical world.
Yeah.
But there's also this kind of like underlying sense that, true fulfillment lies beyond all those earthly things.
Yeah, I get that. I mean, Beowulf, he's a warrior. He values glory and treasure.
Yeah.
But, there are times when it seems like he's looking for something more,
Right.
like some deeper purpose beyond just like winning battles or racking up riches.
Absolutely. And I think that longing, even though it's not like explicitly Christian, it still resonates with that like, basic human desire for God,
Hmm.
that connection to something bigger than ourselves.
Mhm.
And as Catholics, we, understand that as a longing for, union with God, for
Right.
eternal life through Christ.
So even though it's set in this pagan world,
Yeah.
it still speaks to that, like, that basic yearning for something beyond just the material.
Exactly. Yeah. Like those desires are just kind of like woven into our very nature,
Yeah.
regardless of like what we believe. And that actually brings us to another really interesting aspect of Beowulf,
Okay.
how it kind of portrays death.
Right.
I mean, death is everywhere in this poem.
Yeah, it is.
Heroes die, monsters die. Like pretty much everybody meets this like kind of gruesome end.
Yeah.
But it makes you think, what does the poem have to say about, what comes after death? Like what lies beyond?
Well, it's definitely not like, the Bible with like a very clear vision of heaven and hell.
Right.
There are hints of like
Yeah.
this shadowy underworld, but it's not really explained.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's because, that pagan understanding of the afterlife, it was often kind of vague compared to, that Christian view that we
Right.
have. But here's what I find so interesting. Even without a detailed concept of, heaven or hell, Beowulf still suggests that, like, our actions in this life, they have consequences that reach beyond the grave.
Yeah, for sure. Like Beowulf's heroic deeds, those are celebrated long after he's gone.
Exactly.
And Grendel's evil actions, they lead to his destruction, and everyone remembers him as a monster. So
Yeah.
even without a picture of like, heaven or hell, it's still showing that, our choices matter.
Right. Exactly.
Like what we do in this life echoes, beyond our death.
Yeah, it really reinforces that idea that, like, we're accountable for our actions,
Mhm.
that there's some kind of, like, cosmic justice happening.
Which is something that aligns really well with the Catholic understanding of like, judgment.
Absolutely.
That,
Yeah.
our actions have eternal consequences.
Right. Now, for our final point, I think it's interesting to kind of think about, like, the role of grace in Beowulf,
Oh, okay.
because as Catholics, we know that grace is this, like, freely given gift from God that helps us choose good and resist evil. But Beowulf comes before Christianity.
Right.
So how can we even apply this concept of grace to like a pre-Christian text? It seems kind of impossible.
Yeah, it's not like they have, the sacraments or the guidance of the church,
Mhm.
but they do seem to be guided by like, honor and duty,
Right.
like a sense of what's right.
Right.
So where do those impulses come from?
That's a great question. And I think maybe what we're seeing is like, a glimmer of natural law.
Okay.
Like that innate sense of like right and wrong that God has placed in, every human heart. Now, it's not the same as grace.
Right.
But it's a starting point, right? It's like this foundation upon which faith can be built.
So even in this like pre-Christian world, we're still seeing evidence of like, God working in the hearts of people.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's, I think, a really powerful message for us today. It reminds us that God's love and mercy, it extends to all people throughout history and across all cultures.
Wow. That is really powerful. I'm amazed by how much we found in this poem by looking at it through this lens.
Oh.
It's like we unlocked this, deeper spiritual significance that we may not have seen before.
It really is. It's been a fascinating journey for me too. And I hope that, our listeners will be inspired to kind of go back and, reread Beowulf with fresh eyes
Hmm.
and see it not just as a story about, monsters and heroes, but also like a reflection of that, very human search for meaning and purpose
Right.
and ultimately for God.
Beautifully said.
Okay.
And to all our listeners out there, keep looking for those unexpected connections. Keep exploring those hidden depths. You never know what you might find. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.